Welcome to Tomversations. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, the networking nerd, and today I'd like to talk about security. I'd like to take a short detour, though, to talk about software-defined wide area networking, or SD-WAN. It's a huge product category today that includes a lot of interesting technologies designed to tie branch offices and headquarters together and also enable cloud on-ramp and the way that we work today. But there are companies who are developing a lot of additional functionality into SD-WAN, very focused on security. And so Gartner has decided to break that functionality out into its own separate category going forward called Secure Access Service Edge, which is pronounced SASE. What is SASE? Well, I consider SASE to be Unified Threat Management 2.0. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But there are four major components that define what SASE is. It has to be an integrated security model, so we can't add on security as an afterthought. It has to have a cloud focus, so we can't be relying on on-premises boxes in order to do the heavy lifting. It has to be enabled for mobility for workers that no longer work inside of a physical premises. And it has to be edge capable, meaning it does not rely on purpose-built hardware. Those 4 points are very critical to what SASE is. But let's talk about unified threat management for just a moment, because this will help inform the rest of the discussion. What was unified threat management 1.0? Unified threat management, quite simply, was putting all of your eggs into a single basket. After years of having disparate hardware to do things like firewalling, IDS IPS, client scanning, and email scanning, in the late 2000s, we decided why not put it all into one single appliance at the edge of the network where all of the traffic was headed anyway and scan it there. And so we did. And there were a lot of vendors that came out with really good unified threat management boxes. They were easy to use, they were easy to deploy, and they were easy to understand. You didn't have to have specific knowledge about running an IPS and a firewall. You could build policies in one that applied to a lot of different things. And at the time, unified threat management was what we needed. That doesn't mean that unified threat management didn't have problems. The biggest problem of unified threat management was that it didn't scale. When you force all of the traffic in an environment through that box, and then you need to do deep packet inspection in order to figure out what's going on, you can imagine that it was a huge issue, which meant either you were going to suffer from huge performance problems, or you had to buy a comically oversized system in order to be able to handle all of that. And just because we are dealing with edge connectivity, remember that when we say a comically oversized system, we mean you needed to buy two. The other issue is there were some very specific hardware requirements with unified threat management. You couldn't just install it on any box you wanted. It had to be a very specific firewall model. It had to have certain add-in modules that enabled this functionality. I can remember back when I was a VAR deploying some of these boxes and needing to buy this very specific hardware model. And if you wanted to enable the email scanning, you had to buy this very specific email scanning part of it. And you integrated the two together, and it really did feel like they were two separate systems that didn't like to talk to each other, which just increased the performance problems and scalability issues that we saw before. The third issue was what happens when your users are no longer inside your network. Now, back in 2007, this wasn't a huge problem because our workforce wasn't very mobile. Flash forward to 2020, and you can see most people don't work in an office, or they work from home, or they work off of a device that's not really tethered to the corporate network anymore. And unified threat management doesn't work if there's no single point of confluence in order to be able to do all this packet inspection. If I'm working off of my mobile phone from a coffee shop, I'm never going to touch the UTM box. And lastly, there was a problem with best of breed software. UTM, more often than not, was just good enough because we added on modules for these devices that were not purpose built for that purpose. For example, if you were a really good firewalling vendor, you had a really good firewall. Your email scanning, not so much. If you developed a really good email scanner, you had to find a way to attach it to the firewall. Or you had to create your own box, which was a mediocre firewall and IDS, but it did a really great job of email scanning. So one of two things happened. You either had to deal with mediocre performance from all the other tools, or you bought a bunch of these boxes and routed all of your traffic through each of them in order to get the best of breed of each of them, which, surprisingly enough, created performance issues. Imagine that. So how does SASE fix all of these things? What makes SASE Unified Threat Management 2.0? Well, let's go back to our original list. It has to have integrated security. So no more bolting on pieces and imagining that they're all going to work together perfectly fine without any kind of issues. No, they all have to work together from the get-go. There's no more afterthoughts about security. Number two, it's cloud enabled. That solves the scalability issues that we saw in 1.0. If the cloud is available to do all of this crunching of numbers and all of this data offload, then you no longer have to worry about the processor in one box causing all of the problems. As a matter of fact, because you are essentially using a distributed compute system, you can, in essence, create some kind of distributed compute network in order to do all this work. It's great when you don't have to worry anymore about having one or two boxes doing the heavy lifting for the packets that are flowing through your network. When you can rely on all of the edge devices, you have a much more scalable solution. SASE also fixes the issue with mobility. If my users are no longer in my network, it doesn't matter because as long as they're using some sort of a SASE client system or they're using applications that I've marked in the cloud for them to use, they're going to be using my security software. Whether they're using some sort of a virtual VPN to connect to the cloud, or they're using some sort of access methodology through an application. I can ensure that the connectivity is encrypted. I can ensure that the user's identities are verified, and I can make sure that they're using the tools that I have enabled in order for them to work properly. Things like cloud access security brokers or CASBs. If my application requires a CASB for access, it means that I can enforce all of the policy and rules in a CASB to make sure that my users are safe. I can make sure that they're using all of the security tools that I've installed on their devices or given them access to in order to verify that they're actually using my application in a safe and secure manner. And if something happens, if that user becomes exposed or that user travels to a place where I don't feel comfortable with them being able to use the tools anymore, I can implement policy that restricts their use until I can get a handle on things. It's a very powerful capability that didn't exist in Unified Threat Management 1.0. And lastly, I can use those best of breed services because it's all software. I don't need to use some kind of magical hardware box installed and integrated with my on-premises hardware appliance. In fact, I may not even need a hardware on-premises appliance because I can run everything in the cloud. So I just need to get branch connectivity between my branch office, or in this case, my branch could be a mobile device somewhere in a coffee shop, and my headquarters, or my SD-WAN appliance in the cloud, which is serving as a cloud on-ramp. And now everything is protected, everything is connected, and everything is enabled. And I don't have to spend thousands of dollars on a new fancy firewall to make it all work. It happens automatically with software. Now, is there a downside to SASE? Yeah, there is. It's all software, right? And we all know that the world today is running on a subscription model. So, in essence, you can say that SASE is kind of SASE. Software as a service is going to rule your life going forward. Would you like to have an add on for a CASB or some other kind of cool personal firewalling function? Better get ready to pay up because they're going to charge you for each of those. And it's not a bad thing because you are going to be able to recognize the revenue per user. So rather than buying a firewall that's spec'd for 5,000 users because you have 300 and the only other option was to buy a firewall spec'd for 250, you're probably going to be better off in the long run. But that means that every user you add on up to that limit is now going to cost you money because now you're paying, $2 per user per month for this CASB, or, you're paying an extra dollar per user per month for being able to do web filtering for them. So you take the good and you take the bad. Overall, though, I think SASE is a great way to look at this because there are vendors out there who are doing a lot more on the security front to build up the software capabilities of SD-WAN. When you look at SD-WAN, it's essentially a mature technology. It does what it does really well: connect branches to headquarters or to the cloud. It multiplexes connections and it gives significant amounts of flexibility. But for the companies that are just catching up to the market, companies like Cato Networks, Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, they have huge innovations in the security realm that they can offer to make this a lot bigger and a lot better where it needs to be improved. Thanks for stopping by for this conversation. If you'd like to hear more conversations with me about a variety of topics, please make sure to check out gestaltit.com, where you can always find the latest and greatest episode. If you have topics that you'd like to see discussed in a conversation, please make sure to hit me up. I'm always willing to entertain fascinating discussions.